Welcome everyone to our Global Systems Institute weekly seminar. You'll notice that there are a lot of us in the room. Actually, are we unmuted? Yeah, we're live. Okay, great. Yeah, so hey, welcome. Come around. Yeah. Yes, welcome to our Grand Challenges undergraduate students who are doing their projects this week and basically finding solutions to climate change and all associated issues, solving the world. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce you all to Sarah Finch, who is a climate campaigner, activist, who basically won this massive landmark case that she's going to be telling us all about. I'm not going to go into details. Tell us all. And I just want to say a bit about Sarah. So Sarah, in her regular day life, is a writer and an editor, and she works a lot for NGOs and think tanks that look at climate change issues. And she's also worked for Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. So Sarah is a long-time climate campaigner, and she was always interested in the environment. And actually, she did her undergraduate in Bristol in English literature. And she was actually just telling me that she wishes that she'd had, courses about the environment or just talking about climate change at university. Right. So I guess we've come a long way, and so it's great to see you all here, especially the students who are engaging with this topic. And then we'll have loads of time for questions. So, if you have any questions, keep them and really don't hesitate to ask at the end. And also after the seminar's over, we've got tea and coffee and biscuits, and usually we hang around for 20, 30 minutes. So it's a great opportunity to meet each other, to meet Sarah. We've also got several climate student activists in the room, really brave people who are putting their careers on the line and who are doing really amazing stuff that's really inspiring. So definitely stick around and meet those guys after Sarah's talk. Right, so let's just welcome Sarah.
Well, thank you, Rafi. Thank you for inviting me. Can everyone hear me all right? Cool. Yeah, I'm really honoured to be here. I've been to seminars with the GSI before, and there have been some incredible, eminent leading climate scientists. So I'm very honoured to be included in that roster. And I'm also a bit intimidated, mainly because some of those people are really good at PowerPoint, and I'm really bad. So I apologise in advance for the slides I'm going to show you, which are just a photo dump, but they'll give you something to look at other than me. So as Rafi said, I won a big climate case, a huge victory for the climate. So that's great. I think climate litigation is really powerful, but I wanted to acknowledge that climate is the law is not neutral on climate, and equally, while some people get good results, the law is being used to criminalise people who like me are doing what they can to stop new oil production. They get criminalised, they get harassed, and they get their lives interfered with for years. So absolutely honour and respect to those people, and I'm very grateful that for me it worked out differently than that. So okay, as we all know, we need to stop greenhouse gas emissions. That's not controversial. I don't need to explain why to an audience of climate students. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to stop new oil and gas production. If we don't get it out of the ground, it won't be burnt safe. So if you think about oil production, you probably think about something like this, UK oil production, and that is right, because most of our oil and gas production is from the North Sea, from rigs like that. But a tiny proportion, so about 2% of UK oil production and about 0.75% of UK gas production actually come from onshore sites. And the case that I brought was against an onshore site. And here it is, or here it was. That's 2013. As you can see, it's just a field. And then fast forward a few years, oil production. And so I've always been interested in the climate, as Rafi said, and I've had campaigning to stop fossil fuels at a kind of government policy kind of level for years. And then suddenly I found myself living in the middle of an oil rush. I lived in Surrey. And, you know, you may think, people often say, well, I didn't know there was oil production in Surrey. But it has been going on for decades. Surrey and Sussex particularly, on a very small scale. So like one or two little nodding donkeys in the corner of a field, nobody paid them much attention. That was going on most of the past century. And then in the 2010s, these new techniques for extracting difficult to get drops of oil and gas out of shale rocks sort of came over from Australia and the US, and the Weald Basin. People know where the Weald is? I hope you do, because there's some geography people here. Yeah, so between the North and South Downs in the southeast of England is apparently a great area for shale oil and gas. And so in the 2010s, we had things like this. That was something published by EY Consultants saying there was, I think, billions of barrels of oil under the Weald. That's going to make everyone rich. Gatwick Oil could add billions to the UK economy. Gatwick is near to the site that I thought was a place called Horse Hill on the Surrey-Sussex border. So there was a lot of hype around this oil and gas that was suddenly going to make us all rich and turn like Surrey into Texas. And there were all these basically cowboy operator small oil companies hyping it up, putting in applications for oil drilling sites. So that led to a lot of consternation among local people. There was the type of method that I'm talking about used to be called fracking. Now, fracking is a very contested and politicised word. The government redefined fracking in 2015. So now all these sites, you can't call them fracking sites because they fall outside the strictly limited definition of what that is. But back then, the time I'm talking about, they were called fracking, and we had anti-fracking activists from Lancashire coming down from all over the country. We had camps, we had...
I say they can't say that, but would you like to speak to...
Hello. I hope this is better. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there was a kind of anti-fracking campaign, the rush going on, and there were sites dotted around Surrey and Sussex. We had loads of campaigning. We had protest camps. We had direct action in the form of slow walking lorries, lock-ons. The top picture there is some people locked on across the gate of the Horse Hill site to prevent the tankers going in and out. We had lorry surfing and also more kind of family-friendly picnics and bike rides and all sorts of campaigning. Of course, we all objected through the proper planning channels, etc. as well. And a group of people fighting all these different sites around Surrey and Sussex came together. We formed something called the Weald Action Group to support each other. And there were some really brilliant people involved in that. And we had a lot of success. We managed to stop, well, some of these sites got refused planning permission and just went away. Some of them kind of went away anyway, because largely these were not credible companies. These were kind of cowboys whose modus operandi was to hype the prospects, get all sorts of small investors to give them their money, and then find that actually they couldn't go through with it for one reason or another. So a lot of so if you look back, if you went back to about 2016, we were looking at something like 1,400 wells across Surrey and Sussex. Virtually none of those have ever been built, and we had some big victories. But the site nearest to my home, Horse Hill, here it is again. We never managed to really get anywhere with that. And so they got two separate lots in 2012 and in 2017. They got short-term planning permissions for exploratory drilling. So basically drilling wells and testing them for 3 years, limited to 3 years. So that went on, and they then said, of course, oh yeah, there's lots of oil down there. We need we need more time. And then in 2018, they came through with a planning application for 4 more wells and 20 years of full production of oil. They said they could produce 3.3 million tons of oil from this little site. So we obviously objected to that. We all gave it our best shot. We wrote very well-informed objections. We talked to the planners. We talked to the Environment Agency. We thought, okay, so they got these temporary exploratory permissions. They're not going to get the 20 years of production now. Like everyone knows, the context has changed. Planning policy had all changed. You know, we had the Paris Agreement now. We had the government's net zero target. Surrey County Council, which was the decision-making authority, they had themselves declared a climate emergency. So you thought, okay, they're not going to permit 20 years of oil drilling. So this was the day when the decision was made. We all gathered outside, reminded them that they declared a climate emergency. People spoke to the committee, but it went nowhere. This is the oil developer. I just love that quote. So he was saying, like, even Greta Thunberg wants more oil. He said, we're dispelling the unsubstantiated myths and the general scaremongering. This was us talking about climate change, you know, well-known unsubstantiated myth. So, yeah, this is a picture of Surrey County Council Planning Committee voting to give permission for 20 years of oil production in a climate emergency. So that's just a summary of what they agreed to. 500 tons of oil per day for 20 years, 3.3 million tons of oil, and that means 10.6 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Just madness. So we all went to the pub after the planning meeting, really deflated, thinking, okay, we lost. What now? And some people who are a bit more savvy than I was at the time said, okay, we can challenge this legally. We can say this decision's not lawful. So we took legal advice and we were advised, yes, you can do a judicial review. And a judicial review is a kind of court case where you get a judge to look at a decision and say, was it made in did they follow the proper procedures when they made that decision? It's not really saying was the decision right or wrong, but like, did they do everything they should in the process when they made that decision? And we talked to lawyers. We had lots of reasons why they thought it wasn't right. But it basically boiled down to, we thought, okay, this was a simple point. So when you do a development over a particular threshold, so over a particular size or to produce more than a certain volume of fossil fuels, you have to do what's called an environmental impact assessment. And this is the wording here of the law. You basically have to assess the direct and indirect significant effects of the proposed development. And we said, well, they haven't assessed all of the effects because they didn't look at the climate impacts of burning the oil that was to be produced. So they did an environmental impact assessment. They looked at the climate impact of the operation itself. So on that little site, they would have some diesel generators, they'd have some vehicle movements. There would be a certain amount of greenhouse gas emitted from that operation. That was delineated in the environmental impact assessment. But once the oil is out of their gate, they take no further responsibility for it. So we said that Surrey acted unlawfully because they didn't look at all of the direct and indirect significant effects, etc. So it seems really obvious, doesn't it? I mean, everybody that we ever spoke to about it, well, yeah, the emissions from burning that oil is an effect of getting that oil out of the ground, because if you didn't get the oil out of the ground, it wouldn't be burnt, there would be no emissions. And I liked using an analogy of like a cake. So a chocolate cake is 0 calorie if you don't eat it, isn't it? But the whole point of making the cake is to eat it. Yeah, but okay, the cake itself is 0 calorie if you don't eat it. A cigarette, what are the impacts of a cigarette on your health? There aren't any if you don't smoke it. Exactly, and oil is like, you know, net zero if you don't burn it. So it just seemed a really obvious point, but you would not believe how long this case went through the court for 5 years. So just to back up, so okay, we agreed to do this, to bring this case. So this was back in 2019, and the lawyers advised that it's better to get an individual to front a case rather than a group. So when I say we, I mean the Weald Action Group, which is not a formal organisation, but it's like a network of people. But they said it's better that an individual brings his case, not the Weald Action Group, because due to something called the Aarhus Convention, which is a really important international law, individuals have the right to go to court on environmental matters. So if you can prove that you're you're well-intentioned, you're of modest means, etc., you can go to court without the threat of having to pay the other side's costs if you lose. So we looked around for somebody to front this case, and in the end, I agreed to do it, thinking that this was a little thing that would maybe take 6 months and it wouldn't have much impact on my life. 5 years later, I have to say it's changed my life. I would not be here talking to all you people if I hadn't said yes to doing that. But so the first thing we had to do was raise a lot of money. So even though we found some fantastic lawyers who agreed a fixed fee with us that was well below their usual rates, and I had this cost protection, if I lost, I wouldn't have to pay the other side's cost. Our initial fundraising target was £35,000, which is quite daunting for a small group of people. But everyone stepped up. This is just so we had a crowdfunder, which raised over 35,000. Pat here, 71-year-old grandmother, she went, right, I'll do a 100-mile sponsored walk. She raised £5,000. These two young men, they did a 1,000-mile bike ride sponsored. They raised, I think, £2,000, and people to organise music events, art sales, etc. So we got that £35,000, and then that was enough to fund us as far as the High Court, where we lost. Then we had to go to the Court of Appeal, raise another £30,000. So we did it all again, and this time the local XR group helped out. They organised an auction of services and goods and things and etc. So yeah, that was now 65,000 we'd spent, and we lost in the Court of Appeal. So then we were talking about, well, shall we go on? The last, very highest and last court in the UK is the Supreme Court. So we're like, well, shall we appeal to the Supreme Court? That'll be another £35,000. I'm sure people will give us that money again, but is it really right to ask them? Is it throwing good money after bad? So we were really undecided about whether that was a good thing to do. And then an organisation called Law for Change said they would pay all the costs of the Supreme Court. So phew, that was a huge relief. So on we went. And so what's my next? So yeah, as I said, it was 5 years through the court. Basically, we had 2 initial hearings to see if we were eligible to have a judicial review in the first place. The first judge said, oh, no, this case is unarguable. Then we asked for a second opinion, and the other judge also said no. We went to the Court of Appeal and said, like, at least give us a chance to have a hearing. And the Court of Appeal said, yes, you are raising an issue which does affect national planning policy, so it should at least be heard. So we went then to the High Court, we lost there. We went to the Court of Appeal, we lost there. But we lost on different grounds. And also it wasn't unanimous because we had 3 judges in the Court of Appeal, and 1 agreed with us. And basically the High Court judge had said it would have been unreasonable to ask Surrey County Council to assess the indirect emissions, so the emissions from burning the oil, because how could they possibly do that? It would be impossible. But the Court of Appeal went, no, it'd be perfectly possible for them to do that. In fact, as we argued, there are established methodologies for doing that. But it's perfectly possible, but it should be a matter of judgment for the individual local authority, whether they do that or not. And we thought that's like really unhelpful piece of law. You would then get different authorities in different parts of the country making different decisions. And that's not helpful. So that's why we then decided we would go to the Supreme Court. I'll just tell you, it's very wearing, and every time we lost, it was very demoralizing. So going to the Supreme Court, I thought, oh no, here we go again. But we knew that it had been obvious right from the start, really, that it wasn't just about Horse Hill. It wasn't about one site. This highlighted a massive gap in planning policy that routinely, fossil fuel developments were being permitted without looking at their climate impact. So we kind of thought, we have to stick with this because it is really important. And the national importance of it was underlined by all of the bodies that got involved. So the case, as it started out, was me on behalf of the Weald Action Group against Surrey County Council, because they were the people that had messed up. And then from the start, the Secretary of State, so it was at the time, I think it was Genric's department, and then it became Michael Gove, they attached themselves to the council side of the case. We're like, oh no, there's nothing wrong with the law. You know, don't listen to these people. And the Horse Hill Developments Limited, which is the oil company, also. So they all had their lawyers in court. And then Friends of the Earth and National Environmental Group, they attached themselves on my side. And then once we got to the Supreme Court, West Cumbria Mining Limited joined on the council side, and Greenpeace UK on my side, and the Office for Environmental Protection. The first time they'd ever intervened in a court case, and they said they were neutral and not on either side, but their submissions were actually very helpful to our side. And you might think, West Cumbria Mining Limited, why would a company to do with Cumbria want to get involved in a case about Surrey? It just shows you it was not just about Surrey, and that was the company that wanted to, I've got the slide here, they wanted to build the first new deep coal mine in decades. Like coal is history. Nobody's building coal mines anymore. They wanted to. Michael Gove permitted it, and he said it would be net zero. Have you ever heard anything more ridiculous? The scope 3 emissions from that mine would have been estimated 220 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. That is not a net zero mine. And then also another case, all similarly affected, Rosebank. Have you heard of the massive, biggest new oil field in the North Sea? So both of those two things were permitted after Horse Hill, but because my case had dragged on so much, was still going, after they were permitted, environmental groups took out cases against them on exactly the same ground. So they were all held up waiting for my judgment, and others as well. So there was a lot resting on Horse Hill. There were a whole load of North Sea oil and gas fields all just waiting for my judgment to see if they were going to be lawful or not. And then we won. And it was, I don't think it was really, I never really expected that. Having sat through all those earlier hearings and had all those other lawyers sort of putting up all these reasons why, no, it's not so simple. Combustion emissions are not effects of getting oil out of the ground. Kind of, they made it really, really complicated. And I just thought, no way we're going to win this. The Supreme Court, their judgment was just so simple, and they demolished those arguments one after the other. Have I got, so that's just the conclusion. It looks really tiny. Paragraph 174, basically, Surrey County Council's decision to grant planning permission for Horse Hill was unlawful because they failed to assess the effect of the combustion. So one sentence, but as you can see, it's paragraph 174, and the 173 paragraphs before that explain why. And they are some killers, right? I don't expect you to read all this, but I just have this in my slide because I love some of these sentences so much. But basically they're saying, but for the extraction, the emissions wouldn't exist. It makes no difference that the emissions happen in a different part of the world. Yes, that oil will be taken off and refined and sold to another country or whatever. That makes no difference. It was getting them out of the ground that caused those emissions to happen. They are indirect effects. Yes, they're not direct effects. That's why the word indirect is in the law. So yeah, there's pages of this. It was a fantastic judgment. And actually I haven't, so quite apart from all of this really good stuff about how combustion emissions are indirect effects of fossil fuel production, there's other good stuff about how the purpose of environmental impact assessment is so that there can be a fully informed consultation and that all stakeholders can contribute to the decision in full knowledge of what the environmental impacts would be. And they said something like, environmental impact assessment is vital for the democratic legitimacy of decisions. So they're a very robust sort of defense of public consultation and everybody being able to be fully informed and have their say. So it was a huge thing, and like, that's one of my favorite headlines, Scottish Daily Mail. There was lots of stuff about this one woman has destroyed the oil and gas industry. I wish. More hyperbole, woman whose green legacy could be greater than Greta's. That is rubbish, but that was in the Times. But really, not that there's a competition or anything, but there was like incredible press. And so Horse Hill saved, hooray. But as a direct result, the Whitehaven coal mine will not now go ahead. Rosebank and Jackdaw have been ruled unlawful, and plenty of others. So Jackdaw, North Sea gas field, various onshore sites, oil terminal in Belfast, all of them either had their planning permission quashed or their applications withdrawn as a result of this case. Also, it's rippled out into other sectors. Gatwick Airport, they want to build a new runway. They were halfway through their sort of public inquiry into this when my judgment happened. So the planning inspector wrote to everyone who'd submitted evidence on that, said, right, okay, now can you submit evidence on whether this judgment affects the runway? And so this was their decision of particular significance in the light of the Finch case. At the bottom, we recommend refusal. Now, that sounds good, but unfortunately, they gave the government a kind of get out. Like, if they apply lots of conditions to the Gatwick runway, then it would be okay to approve it. The developers had already said they couldn't meet any of these criteria, but even if they did, they wouldn't deal with the greenhouse gas emissions. So that is not really job done, but it's an encouraging step forward. And then industrial agriculture, this mega farm that would have had millions of chickens over the course of a year and tens of thousands of pigs in Norfolk, horrific, all living in these giant sheds, that got refused. And again, I watched the planning decision on that online, and there's lots of discussion of my case, and they're going, well, we have to take account of the indirect impacts of this, which in this case, it would be the upstream impacts would be the deforestation to produce the soy to feed all those animals, and the downstream impacts would be all the manure, all the ammonia, the emissions from the sheds. So that got refused. So that's great too. And then even better, I've got a consultation named after me. The government has done 2 consultations. So one was on environmental impact assessment of oil and gas. How should we do it? And the other one was on Britain's North Sea energy, the future of the North Sea or something, all about energy, about fossil fuels, how do they wind them down, solar and wind, how do they ramp them up, how do they ensure a just transition, etc. So these 2 consultations have both taken place and both closed. But while the first one was happening, all new, well, and still now, all new assessments of all new North Sea oil and gas fields are on hold. So nothing has been able to be approved or processed in the last year. So the whole North Sea basically closed for business thanks to our fight over one little field in Surrey, which in the scheme of things was very tiny. So so we're very familiar in climate with the concept of tipping points, where one small change and suddenly everything gets much worse, much more quickly and unpredictably. And I said last year that I thought the Horse Hill win was a tipping point, when suddenly one little change and actually everything will get much less worse. And I really hope that is the case. And all these things I've talked about, I think, are promising signs. But everything is subject to politics. And I think litigation is really important, and governments should be told what they have to do. But they can change the law and they can easily get around it. So I think the real test of whether my judgment actually is a tipping point is going to be, well, the new guidance that they give on assessing scope 3 or downstream emissions, which they're looking at that consultation now, so they'll process all of those things and come up with their new guidance. And then what they do with the first new applications they get, so particularly Rosebank, because that's such a big one. So what happened as a result of my judgment was that those planning permissions all got quashed, but they can apply again. The Whitehaven, the coal mine in Cumbria have said they won't apply again, so that's finished. But Rosebank and Jackdaw, those developers, so Equinor and Shell, have said they will apply again. So they have to redo their environmental impact assessment. They have to do a proper quantification of all of the emissions, including from burning the oil, and then the government is back to the government to make that decision again. Will they make the right decision? So that's not very promising, is it? She said, they will go ahead. We're committed to doing that, and go ahead, they will. She's talking about Rosebank and Jackdaw. And that was Rachel Reeves in The Sun, basically saying they will permit them when they come back. Totally jumping the gun here. They haven't reapplied. They haven't made their environmental impact assessments. The guidance on impact assessment hasn't been published. There's no way that anyone can preempt that decision. And I think, thankfully, those quotes, normally they get quoted around everywhere. I think that got quickly suppressed, and then the government made some more mealy-mouthed comments about we'll follow due process. But that gives you an indication of what at least some people in the government are thinking. Thankfully, not everyone. This is at Miliband, called Rosebank, a colossal waste of taxpayer money and climate vandalism. So stick to your guns, Ed. And I think so what can we all do about this now? I think the challenge facing us is to make the government understand how important this really is to all of us, that permitting Rosebank when it comes back is actual climate denial, and we don't want it. And we know that's something, I'm never very good at remembering numbers. 69% of British people think climate change is one of the most important issues, or the most, I'm not sure about that, don't quote me, but the majority, is that six? Is it? 73, 89. Very depends what you ask them exactly. But I know that a majority of even particularly, I think it is 64% of Labour voters in the one that I saw. 1 million people recently signed petitions, similarly worded petitions on keeping new oil and gas in the ground. And we are the majority, but the government seem more afraid of reform voters. It should be climate voters that we're worried about. So I think what we have to do in the next few months, because it's only going to be that long, I think the new guidance on environmental impact assessment for oil and gas is expected to be published this month. Once it's out, you can bet all of those people that have been held up, so Rosebank, Jackdaw, all the rest, will all be submitting their new applications. And then we need the government to understand that we actually really care about this. And they've done a U-turn on winter fuel payments, I believe. They look like doing one on the sort of benefit, two-child benefit limit. So we need to make them realize that this is as much of a hot potato as those. And so that's one of our old placards. So yeah, so just to wind up, I just want to say that, yeah, it was a fantastic experience. I had the chance to be part of this incredible legal win. And although my name's on it, it was absolutely not me on my own. It was a whole group of us, and we had amazing lawyers, tons of great supporters. It was a great thing. And it could be that it'll go down in the history books as the moment that, you know, sanity prevailed and the UK stopped exploiting oil and gas. That could happen, or it could not. So let's really hope it goes the right way. There's only one major oil producing company that has committed to leaving its oil and gas in the ground, and that's Colombia. It would be great if the UK was the second. We are the second biggest oil producer in Europe. We have a big kind of legacy of basically were the first to exploit coal, I believe. And, you know, we have a big responsibility here. We could really do the right thing by being the first or the second country, the first European country to pledge to leaving all our oil and gas in the ground. It is possible, but it's not inevitable. And so thank you all, everyone here. Exeter University scientists are brilliant. And I'm really, really pleased to know there is this many students that are working on climate solutions, because we need those. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Sarah. Woo. All right. Questions? Time for questions. We have loads of time. So far away.
I will.
So yeah, when it went to the Supreme Court, what different tactics did you have? I'm not tactics the right word, but what difference did you do going into that Supreme Court decision that made them change their mind from the previous two?
Makes sense.
I don't know, because it seemed to me we kept on just saying the same things we'd always said. But I think we had our great lawyer, Estelle Dehon, who's like a rising star of climate law. She just made it very much about plain language. And in the lower courts, there was lots of kind of discussion of like finer legal points, but she just kept it down to like, what is an effect of something, what is a direct and indirect effect. And I think the plain language worked then. I think the Supreme Court judges are just a bit more free in their minds, maybe. I think the the High Court judge we got and two of the appeal court judges were planning specialist judges. So they'd spent their whole careers probably talking about the ins and outs of environmental impact assessment. The Supreme Court judges took a wider view. But I don't think we really did anything differently. I just think we got a better hearing. And I should say, it wasn't unanimous. There were 5 Supreme Court judges and there was 3 on our side and 2 on the other. And so I still wake up at night thinking like, oh, it could have gone the other way. There was the judge called Lord Leggett, who was sort of seen to be the lead judge. And I could tell right from the hearing that he was totally on our side. And so maybe he persuaded the others.
Thank you.
Should we just take 2 questions?
Thank you very much for that presentation. This is just my thinking. I totally agree with what you're saying. Did you have to put forward alternative to gas, basically, to the oil? Did you have to sort of, because obviously a lot of people are thinking, like at the moment where I live, which is not far down the road, they're putting in all these new gas pipes. So obviously, presumably this gas is coming from the oil. I don't know. So what I'm trying to say is, what will be the alternative to getting the oil, basically?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's basically just going.
Yes,
People can't hear us without the mic online.
It's really quick. It's basically just going off what the first question said, that I don't know anything about climate litigation, but if it had gone the other way and the findings had said, oh, actually oil extraction is allowed in Horse Hill, like would that risk for climate litigation have been like really high? Like would we not have been able to like go back and try to reverse that in the future? And so like maybe what were some of the like climate litigation conversations around the risks of bringing this to court, or like alternative ways of going about this?
Thanks for both those questions. The first question, we didn't as part of the court case. No, in the court case, it was just all about, was this decision made in the right way? Nothing about any alternatives or any of that. So no, there's obviously a huge question about how we get off oil and gas. And there's probably people in this room much more expert than me about that, but I think basically it's about very quickly electrifying all the things that can be electrified, and saving gas for those things that are really very hard to decarbonize. But that didn't come into the court case at all. And yes, the high stakes, like, is there a danger that you lose and make everything worse? That was a very present thing in our minds. But by the time we got to the Supreme Court, we had already lost and made it worse. A terrible moment for me was when Michael Gove approved that Whitehaven coal mine, because he cited my case as an example of why I'd lost at that time. So my High Court ruling was that no, it would be ridiculous for a planning authority to have to take this into consideration. It's not a planning matter. So yeah, we had already made that worse. And so and I got lots of hate mail about that. But no, not lots. I got some hate mail from very frustrating climate campaigners like, you've made everything worse, you naive idiot, with your silly little onshore site that's tiny in comparison. But so then when we went to the Court of Appeal, actually, we kind of made things better. And so one of the considerations about going to Supreme Court was like, well, would they take us back to the High Court position? So it wasn't an easy decision. There was always in our mind the knowledge that we could set an unhelpful precedent, and we had to really rely there on our lawyers. But as well as getting the funder, another thing that made us confident to go to the Supreme Court was the Office for Environmental Protection said they were going to intervene. Also, well, this was kind of some government lawyers to talk to us, and like we got the impression that yes, it was going to be worth going ahead to Supreme Court. But yeah, with definitely there's always a risk of making things worse. And we did do things worse. And I do kind of feel very grateful actually now that we lost in those lower courts, and where we won was in the Supreme Court, which that can't be trumped, that is the top. So that judgment is safe. But that's only, all we did was clarify the meaning of one sentence in the environmental impact regulations. There's plenty of other laws that, like, you know, pro oil developers probably could use to get around it. Who knows?
Wait. Can I get show of hands of questions? Okay. One, right, so I'll take
Oh, thanks. Hard to your elbow, Sarah. Well done on all that. Just the very final point you made about other laws there. So you would assume that a lot of climate litigation, or a lot of the other litigation that's going on, is around human rights and breaches of human rights by various developments and by the impacts of climate change. Or actually, a great hope, of course, is the Climate Change Act itself from 2008. But the problem with the Climate Change Act, as you know, is the goals are way in the future. And so if you say, well, this isn't, digging oil out the ground in Surrey or even in the North Sea is not compatible with our climate targets, there's just so much wiggle room around that. And so where do you think the, if you can get over the planning laws or whatever, but where do you think the next action is, or where do you think the other most effective areas of climate litigation are going to be, either around, in the UK or actually elsewhere? Because a lot of the action seems to be around a sort of human rights law. Thanks.
Well, the simple answer is I don't really know. As you say, there's lots of climate litigation going along around the world on lots of things. So human rights is one thing, but also one like corporate, impacts of corporate thing, national targets, greenwashing, all sorts. And I don't really know. I think there's been some interesting things about responsibility of corporations, and you may have seen a case that actually there was a judgment or a sort of interim ruling on this week or last week about a Peruvian farmer who was suing a German energy company for trying to get compensation for the impacts of flooding in his town caused by a lake that's formed because of melting glaciers, basically. So he's asked this German company to pay something like 4% of the cost of protecting his property, because it calculated that their emissions totally is sort of 4% of global historic emissions. And that case has been going on for a long time. And there was a ruling, which was kind of mixed ruling, because the court in Germany said, no, this man shouldn't get this compensation because there's not enough evidence that his own property is directly at risk from this lake that's about to flood. But the principle of corporations having to pay compensation for climate damage is good. And I think that there are other cases going through, but I think that basically opens up a whole leash. Basically everyone anywhere who's been affected or is going to be affected by climate change now kind of has a legal go ahead to like go after all the really big oil and gas companies and the big polluters. So I think that one is going to be big. Yeah, I don't know. Things like national climate targets, I just think they're too vague. And I think that's the kind of case that would just basically have lawyers arguing for years and years, and we don't have time for that. And I don't know, I really don't know what's the most promising area. I don't know how many people here were at that talk by Ben Franta a couple of months ago. He's a sort of environmental law specialist, climate law specialist, and he talked about, so many different cases around the world, some promising, some less so. So I think it's a whole huge area, and it's all to play for, really. And meanwhile, we're having regressive governments kind of like stopping, rewriting laws, etc. So I don't know. I couldn't predict.
Yeah, that talk by Ben Franta, by the way, is on the GSI YouTube channel, and it's talk about climate litigation. I'm going to take a couple of questions online. So the first one is about how you mentioned several organizations who basically fought the court case with you. Could you say a few words about what role did each one play? And the other question, do you fear that the government will change environmental impact assessment law entirely to lessen environmental predictions? Are you worried about that?
Thank you. So the first question, the other organisations. So Friends of the Earth got involved right from the start. So pretty much as soon as we announced we were doing this, their sort of head of law rang me up and said, like, really interesting case, we would like to intervene. So they joined as it's called an intervener, which and they got permission to intervene on paper only. So they didn't have lawyers in the courtrooms. They put in their submissions on paper. And they were also the people who took, or one of two groups that took legal challenge against the coal mine. So yeah, so that was just another set of lawyers. And I know their lawyers worked closely with my lawyers and made sure that they sort of made different points, etc. Then Greenpeace joined later, same thing, but they had a specific interest because they were involved in some of the North Sea cases, including ones that have been held up on the back of my case. And the Office for Environmental Protection also submitted their own, again, only on paper, and the Supreme Court said their points were particularly helpful. And theirs were not so much about the details of greenhouse gas emissions, but about the need for clarity in environmental law and the fact that this was now a really muddy area and it needed sort of a decisive ruling from the Supreme Court so that everybody knew where they stood.
Any key lessons learned of that process, that collaborative process?
I don't know. I'd say that we had the relationship so we, the Weald Action Group, had a different relationship. So with Friends of the Earth, they not only had their sort of lawyers writing submissions, but they did a lot of help with media campaigning. They sort of encouraged their supporters to come to our events. They invited us to events. They did some reports. I think we were one of 4 cases they highlighted. So us, the coal mine, a case in Mozambique, and I can't immediately remember what the other one was. So they did quite a lot of good work in the media, sort of making the case about how these cases were all interlinked. So that was quite a deep involvement. With Greenpeace, it was very much just in the courtroom. I didn't have anything to do with them personally myself. But yeah, I think it really helped us in terms of media. It did help demonstrate that we weren't just fighting about our local issue. It wasn't just a story about Surrey. It was a national story, and we got national press coverage. And yeah, Friends of the Earth helped in lots of ways. They helped with reaching out to MPs, all sorts of things. And the second question, yes, will the government abolish environmental impact assessment? Yes, that is a risk. And I was very, very glad that we didn't get our judgment till like just a month before the government changed, because the Sunak government had already said they were going to replace environmental impact assessment with something called, I think, environmental outcome reporting. So yeah, could have been gone. And that sort of Sunak legacy thing is still on the statute books, and the government could bring it back. So it could happen. They have said that because the EIA regulation is derived from EU law, but it was fully incorporated into UK law. It's a UK law that originated in Europe, and governments have said if they kind of do more to kind of domesticate EU-derived laws, there won't be any regression. So it won't get worse. But look what they've just done with the planning bill. You can't trust them. So no, I don't have any confidence they won't do that. I feel like, why would they waste political capital getting rid of the EIA now when they're already like getting flack for other things? But that's why I really think our best hope is to just keep making this a political issue and not let it just be a legal issue.
So there's a couple questions over there. Are there? Yes. Okay, you're next after. Well, okay, Natalie and Stuart next. Any other questions? We have loads of time. Okay. All right.
Thanks so much. That was really inspiring and gives us all hope, I think. Can you say anything about the economic impact? So did shareholders start pulling out, or investors start reducing investment in these oil companies after the court ruling, do you know?
Yeah, and I'd just like to hear a bit more about, well, your reflections on the kind of runway expansion issue, particularly given the Chancellor of the Exchequer's intention to approve a third runway at Heathrow, and what you think the approach needs to be in opposing that, given that one of her arguments is based on sustainable aviation fuels, which of course is very questionable. Thanks.
You know, I've already forgotten the first question. Economic. Oh yeah, yeah. How could I forget? Well, so the oil company, then UK Oil and Gas Limited, but they also go by the name Horse Hill Developments Limited. Basically, yes, their investment history is quite dramatic anyway, because they're one of these firms that just hyped to small investors. So they got a lot of people who would invest, you know, who in the past £10,000 maybe that they really couldn't afford, and then they were like totally invested in that company doing well in an emotional way. So and the share price went up and down. I should have brought the graph of the share price on the day of the decision, because it was just like but basically the shares are you know, which probably at one time were worth, I don't know, £10, are now worth less than 0.01% of a penny. So yeah, it's kind of sad for the investors, but I don't, you know, I feel they were mugs to invest in that company anyway. But that was one of the kind of quite entertaining aspects of the campaign, was looking at the investor share chat, who really hate us, and they call us swampies, and they were like, "Oh, swampies in court again," and I don't know. So yes, it did affect those investors, but I don't think it probably made much impact on general overall oil industry investors. Yeah, runways. One of the things about having won this victory is I get asked about things I really am not qualified to talk about. I don't know. Yes, I know Rachel Reeve said that she would approve Heathrow, and they very much want to approve Gatwick, and there's another 7 or so airports all with plans to expand. And, you know, we obviously know that sustainable aviation fuels is a fantasy. I mean, it's good that people are working on them, and maybe at one point they'll invent proper zero emissions flights, in which case, hooray, we can all fly. But there's no realistic prospect of that. And I just think there is absolutely no way that expanding any airport is going to be sustainable. Heathrow as well, such a huge amount of destruction of like homes and things that they need to do, and rerouting the M4 motorway or M25, which, yeah, it's like Heathrow has lost court case after court case. It would have been built now if it was viable. I just don't see that it's really going to happen. But I just think this talk from the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, as if so-called economic growth trumps everything else, is dangerous, and that has to be fought. Same as with oil. You know, I think there's no way they should get away with passing any more runways anywhere. But that's an opinionated and ignorant answer, because I don't know much about it.
Not that ignorant.
Okay, so I'm going to pass this on to
Hello. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing. It's absolutely incredible. It kind of relates to previous question, but like, how would you say recent council elections, considering like Reform have the majority of councils across England, would impact like local environmental impact assessments in like other things like bus routes or river runoff things, considering like policies, and especially how that's leaking into national policies in Labour, trying to appeal more to Reform voters than like actual green environmentalists who would, you know, favour the Labour Party previously. Kind of.
Okay. Yeah, actually, you can keep it going.
Yeah, really good question. And yeah, I think, well, I'm sure everyone is absolutely horrified by the results of the council elections, and the fact that Reform are now actually running some councils, and they have been talking up like, you know, fracking, they want to bring it back. I think the one encouraging thing to say is they can't get around environmental impact assessment because council planning authorities have to operate within planning law as it exists. So they can't just decide that they don't have to do environmental impact assessments, or they, you know, that they can just approve developments if they want to. They can't do that. And if they tried to, that would be subject to legal action, etc. So they haven't probably got as much power as some of them might think. But I think, well, for me, the biggest and most worrying thing is that, yeah, they've given Labour the impression that they're the ones that are stealing their votes, and they've got to kind of be more reform than reform to win those people back. As if you think anyone who supported reform policies is going to vote reform, they're not going to vote Labour. I think Labour should be much more afraid of threats from the left, including our newly elected Green councillor sitting at the back. And I think a slightly positive, you know, one cheering thing to take from the local elections is that Greens did very well as well. And yeah, I think if I could like have words with Keir Starmer, I would just say, listen to the people who care about the climate, listen to the left-wing voters. You know, you're courting these votes in reform, you're driving people to the Greens and the Lib Dems. But I think it's a very dangerous and difficult time, because I think, you know, there's so much wrong with our society, and one big thing is the media and people who don't have the time or the inclination to think things through. It's very hard for them to get a sort of fair view of things, and they're told net zero is expensive and immigrants are a problem, etc., and they vote reform. So yeah, it's terrible, terrible thing. But yeah, just in terms of environmental impact assessment, they can't get around that.
All right.
Sarah, thanks for introducing me. I wasn't expecting that. I'd just say, just to the end of the last question, it's not for me to grandstand, it's your show today, Sarah. But, you know, Devon has just gone into a joint Green and Lib Dem administration, and reform aren't at the table. And so it shows that, you know, where people decide to vote progressively, they'll get progressives in. So, you know, so lots of positives out there. It just so happens that the media like what reforms say, but people like what progressives are trying to do. So it's just to get behind that. So can I just swing it back to you and say, you know, Sarah Finch, you are the new Greta Greenberg. We've heard all about that. You know, I don't want to make a poll in the room of who thinks Greta's more cool than you or not. I think I can guess how that might go. But you know, you've done, you've really put yourself into this, and I'm kind of hoping to hear from you that, you know, you've had a bit of time out, and what you might have planned next for the environmental movement. No pressure.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I mean, basically, I'm a kind of ordinary person with a particular thing about climate. And before this, my preferred form of activism was like sitting in my kitchen writing objections to planning applications. And I've suddenly become a kind of poster person for climate litigation, which, as I've demonstrated, is not something I'm very expert in. So I really so what I feel like the surprising thing for me is I feel this isn't still over. People say, what are you going to do next? I'm still doing this. Like I really want to see this judgment properly bedded in, and the new guidance on environmental impact assessment, I want that to be good. And I want Rosebank and Jackdaw and these others to be definitively refused. Because like if Rachel Reeve has her way and she approves them, and Heathrow, whatever, then there was no point in anything I did. So I feel like I'm still, what I'm currently trying to do is trying to make sure everybody knows that this Jackdaw decision is going to be coming up again at some point this year, in a few months' time, because I think that is going to be an absolute litmus test. Rosebank is a household name, really, or in as much as any climate thing ever is, and we've totally got to win it. So that's my current focus.
All right. And on that note, we're going to wrap up questions, although those of you here in the room do stick around for tea and coffee afterwards to chat with Sarah and with each other. And really, I mean, I'm just so awed by what you've accomplished, Sarah. And I know you've done it as part of a group, and yeah, as a collective, you know, we're stronger. And yet at the same time, it all depends. It's all upon each and every one of us as individuals, right? So if there's something you feel strongly about, go for it, pursue it, be persistent, and really, demand answers. We have a right to demand answers from our governments, from the corporations that are selling us this oil, and we have a right to a brighter future, and it's up to each and every one of us. So yeah, go for it. All right.